Okay, here we are starting on week 6. Last week was an excellent week, and I posted a video talking about the results of that. But my experience is every week is a little bit different. So let's get into it. We're going to hustle through. So for the first game, for the Thursday night game, we got the Washington Commanders against the Chicago Bears. The point spread on this is even, and I'm showing pretty much the same thing. What I would point out is the Commanders are really just a poor team. They're poor point differential, poor offense, both pass and rush, and the defense the same thing. But then again, Chicago Bears really they're only strong in one area, and that's their offensive pass, and that's only in passing efficiency. So let's look at the numbers here. The one thing that I would point out is we're showing that the Commanders should have somewhat better passing against the Bears. But I would also point out the Bears also have um, a stronger running game. And so we'll see which one of those two went out. But I would predict that it's going to be a low scoring game and it could go either way. All right, let's get on to the next game. Tampa Bay versus Pittsburgh. So what I would point out here is Tampa Bay is favored by 8.5 points. This model says it's going to be probably more like a 13 to 15 point difference. So one thing I would point out is with this model, it does not take in consideration the human element, such as a team is going to, when you're far ahead, is going to pull up necessarily or start doing things run down the clock. It does some of that, but it's really hard to predict that human element. But what I would point out is both the point spread and the model shows Tampa Bay is heavily favored. And then all you have to do is look at the rankings of Pittsburgh. They're a poor team all the way around. And the numbers reflect that. So there's really not much point going through the run and pass charts and such. Overall, Pittsburgh, they turn the ball over a lot. They pass poorly. They defend poorly. They run poorly. Provided Tampa comes out with their normal game plan, they should be okay. Next game, Jets versus Green Bay Packers. So the line has Green Bay favored by 7.5 points, but notice I'm showing that this is pretty close to an even game with a slight advantage to the Jets. That's it's. I'm not entirely sure how that matchup goes. I would need to break that down a little bit more. Uh, Only because when you look at the Jets, they've got a poor offense all the way around, as compared to the Packers. They've got or they've got Aaron Rodgers, and they've got a good rushing game. But overall, when you do the direct matchup, which is what this algorithm does, is it's plotting, comparing how each team, how those matchups go play by play by play. And what this is really pointing out is that the the Green Bay pass should be relatively ineffective, even though the run game should be a little bit better. It just isn't really looking like that's going to match up as well against the Jets. And overall, historically speaking, I know the Jets don't always do that, aren't a great team, but they have uh, uh, they have the same record as Green Bay, and they've beaten some good teams too. So that one should be an interesting to watch. And given the point spread, I'd probably be likely to take the Jets on that one, even though they are playing at Green Bay. Let's move on to the next game. So New England against Cleveland. Cleveland is favored by 3.5 points. My model is showing a little bit less of an advantage for Cleveland, but not too much different. Um, Overall, I would say that if it weren't for the rushing game for Cleveland, they're a pretty poor team. And the same as looks like New England, I think, is a better balanced team. But when the way that those just match up, both teams do have very strong rushing games. Cleveland is a bit better, quite a bit better. It'll be interesting to see if they can maintain that. Um, and I'm also showing that really Cleveland should be dominating the time of possession, which is what is going to lead to that to the advantage that they have. All right, next game. Minnesota versus Miami. This is an interesting one because I just don't think Miami has any quarterbacks left, so we'll see who they throw out there to play. The point spread has Minnesota favored by 2.5 points. The model here says it's really even. And when you look at it, that's because both teams certainly have some poor elements of it. But what I would point out is Miami has some pretty strong points when it comes to their offensive pass and then their defensive rush. But it's who knows what's going to happen with that passing game with Tua out. But I would still point out that they've got Tyreek Hill, and they've got a really explosive offense. And so if you can get the ball in their hands, you should be okay. And that's what I think the model is showing. And it's also showing an advantage in terms of the ball possession but it is showing an advantage for Minnesota for the time of possession. So it'll be interesting to see how the explosiveness versus controlling the ball. So if you look in the upper right hand corner, you see that with the circle there that Miami is going to have a more explosive offense, but they're also going to have more sacks and not nearly as good turnover ratio. But if you look down, you see that Minnesota just looks like they're going to control the ball a little bit better. So again, that's going to be a tight one. Should be even, but they have the point spread at Minnesota favored by 2.5. Next is Dallas, Philadelphia. Philadelphia is favored by 4.5 points. My model gives them a little bit more advantage than that. It'll be a relatively low scoring game, I would think, especially since I don't think Dallas is going to have Dak Prescott back. But Philly's got a strong team this year, that's for sure. But they can kind of, as we saw last week, they can be highly explosive. And we can see that here if you look on the right on their Eagle passing yards, that it's showing the potential for some really high passing yards, but it's really showing a really rather lackluster capability of the Cowboys to be able to pass the ball. But I would point out that the Cowboys do have a strong rushing game, which tends to be an equalizer, but it shouldn't be any better than what that of the Eagles have. And so with that, it looks as though there might be a time of possession advantage for the Cowboys. But again, this I would give the advantage overall to the Eagles with just a more explosive team overall. Next game is Cincinnati versus New Orleans. Cincinnati is favored by 1.5 points. I'm showing New Orleans should be taking this one. Again, it's always a toss-up to see who New Orleans is going to have as their quarterback, with Jameis Winston still showing as though he's going to be out. But I am showing that advantage for the New Orleans Saints. What I would point out is if you look at the New Orleans, they still have a high efficiency, and again, that's what this model is based off, yards per attempt. They're consistent. They're in the top 10 for both their pass and their rushing ranks. Meanwhile, Cincinnati is not nearly as consistent. And as we go to the next chart, that's one of the things we'll look at. If you look at the upper left-hand corner here with the run-pass chart, we all know what Joe Burrow can do. We saw glimpses of it in the last game, and the model is saying that is a potential for him to be there. But overall, when you do the matchup, it's still supposed to be close, but with an edge toward New Orleans, and it's at New Orleans, so that is something that you can also consider. All right, Baltimore versus the Giants. The line has Baltimore favored by 5.5 points. I show them not quite that much, more like 2.5 points. Giants have a strong team this year, which we haven't been able to say for a while. And if we go down and we look at the next chart here, what we're looking at is Saquon Barkley and the Giants have an extremely strong rushing game. That notwithstanding, Baltimore has a strong rushing game as well, and they're about the same when it comes to their passing games. What I would point out is that Baltimore has a bit more of an explosive offense, and they're a little bit better at controlling the balls. If you look at the Giants, they're more likely to give up more sacks, more interceptions, and more turnovers, and that tends to make a difference in some of these type matchups. Okay, for the next matchup, Jacksonville versus Indianapolis. This is one where it's difficult to understand. So the line has Indianapolis favored by 2.5 points. The model really likes Jacksonville. What I point out down here, these two have played each other this year before, and Jacksonville dominated them 24-0. And that was only 4 games ago. So when you look at it, you say, wow, the line has Indianapolis favored by 2.5 points, but just a month ago they got completely hammered by Jacksonville. Not much. The teams haven't changed. I don't think that either team has significant differences in terms of injury status or anything like that. So it's interesting that the line would flip that much. But the model is looking at the pure numbers, and they're coming up to saying, hey, it's pointing out that Jacksonville is just a better team and should and has a sizable advantage on Indianapolis. So that'll be an interesting one to watch. The one thing I would point out is that teams change, they evolve, and sometimes the numbers don't catch up with that, or don't reflect what some of those differences might be. So moving on to the next game, San Francisco versus Atlanta. San Francisco is favored by 5.5. The model really likes San Francisco here by a bit more than that. Like I said, the model does not put on throttles. It puts on some throttles when you start to get a point spread, but when you stop to look at it, if you look at the overall rankings of the San Francisco team, they have strong defense, strong passing efficiency. Jimmy Garoppolo, if he does not turn the ball over, he's a very efficient quarterback. Whereas if you compare that to Atlanta Falcons, they have a strong offense, but they just really haven't been playing all that particularly well. And then when we look at the numbers over here, if you look at the pass, the Atlanta overall matchup does not favor their passing game to be as effective as what one might think, whereas San Francisco should have both a strong run and a pass game. So those are the things that are really going to make it make a difference here. And I would also point out that San Francisco overall can control the ball quite a bit better. They're going to protect the quarterback. Don't expect as many turnovers. Jimmy G seems to be doing a lot better at that this year, and they've got an explosive offense. That leads to big wins in the NFL. All right, looking at the next matchup, we've got Arizona against Seattle. The line has Arizona favored by 2.5 points. The model is really favoring Seattle here. The one thing I would point out is if you look at Arizona's rankings overall, they're really not all that good, but Seattle has a really efficient run and passing game. And let's take a look at the next set of slides here. Seattle, they've got some explosiveness going on. They got Geno Smith, kind of came out of nowhere. I would also point out that sometimes it's hard to predict that regression to the mean. When is that going to happen? Is it going to happen? I don't know. Thus far, the numbers are reflecting that Seattle has a fairly strong run and pass game, and their defense is sufficient to get their offense back out on the field there. And overall, Seattle's controlling the ball. Those sorts of things lead to the record that they have, which is, I'm going to phrase that. Their record isn't great, but they've certainly had some good wins. That's for sure. They've looked a lot better than I think what a lot of people would give them credit for. Moving on to the next game. Again, with Buffalo against Kansas City, I realize that Buffalo is favored by 2.5 points. The model is really favoring Buffalo here. Do I really expect Buffalo to win by more than 21 points? Probably not. The model is predicting that Kansas City will score right around 16 points. I'm not sure that I really buy that, but at the same time, um, Kansas City can be inconsistent as well. And when they're faced against, as you look at the overall rankings across the board for Buffalo, they've they've got strong offense, defense, pass, rush. It doesn't matter. And so when you take that against a team that has some thus far, their numbers haven't reflected that, is you can get some big point differentials here. Um, but at that same point in time, with Buffalo, with them having that as such a close game as what it is, numbers certainly reflect that Buffalo should win by a bit more than that. And overall, when I look at these numbers here, you look at the upper left, you see fairly similar pass and rush. What I would point out is it saying that Buffalo has a chance to really score some points. We'll see how that goes because we know that both teams can be really explosive as well. I also point out is that Kansas City hasn't exactly been taking great care of the football, great care of the quarterback, but both teams are explosive. But it just looks like thus far it's really reflecting that Kansas City should be the much more explosive team in this matchup. All right, next matchup. This one is also a little bit of a head scratcher for me. The odds have LA favored by 10.5 points. The model likes Carolina. What I would point out is I believe that Carolina does not have any quarterbacks either. I believe all three of their primary quarterbacks are on the injured list. So I can understand favoring them in that case. The Rams have not played well this year. This should be a low scoring game either way. And so it's difficult to predict how a team's going to do when they have so many injuries at the quarterback position. So I'm not sure that I like the Rams for 10.5 points, but I'm not sure. But I would probably say that I would favor them to win given the injuries that Carolina has as well. So again, injuries can make that very difficult to predict, especially at the depth that you see with Carolina. And looking at this right now, if you look at the upper right, when you see the Rams, the number of sacks and the likelihood of those sacks, that's pretty high. You see the same thing for Carolina below, and I would expect that's probably going to be the case. Is the team that can protect their quarterback and not turn the ball over will probably be the team that wins, and that's really hard to predict because especially when you have a quarterback like Matthew Stafford, who's a veteran and can be so good when he settles down. But 10.5 points is a lot. All right, let's get to the last game. Broncos versus the Chargers. The Chargers favored by 5.5 points. The model is favoring Denver. This is one to where sometimes when you go through and you look at the numbers, it's difficult to understand how those matchups come out over the course of 200 different samples. So that's how this is done. Is I replay the game 200 times, just play it over and over again, and then you take the aggregate of those, and that's where it's saying that Denver should score right around 31 points, with the Chargers scoring closer to 20 points. I would also say that if you look at how Denver has played this year, they've only scored more than 20 points once this year. So it's difficult to understand how that's going to be. But then when you look at the Chargers and you look at their defense, you can look at it and go, oh, okay, I can see how that could be. We'll see what team shows up. But what I'll also point out when I look at this, I see that the Denver's rush should be slightly better than what's projected with the Chargers, except for if you look at this last week with the Chargers, I believe that was the first week that Austin Eckler came back. That type of thing really throws that back in the opposite direction, which is probably what the what Vegas is looking at. So I can see why the Chargers to win is probably a better pick in this case, because when you get a player back like that, it completely throws off the dynamics, in which case it should also give their quarterback quite a bit more possibilities to perform as well. So that concludes the review of week 6. And what we'll do is we'll review next week on Tuesday to see how these picks went. So anyhow, good luck, and we will review this next week. Have a good weekend.